keeping the bulletin with you. There's a lot of names on there that give a prayer for support in the week. Let me, even though we have Fran Finley's name on there, we need to update her position. She's now in the hospital. Yes, we can. She roughed that up all night long. And got her to the hospital this morning.
Helps when you turn it on. I've done that before. Do not adjust your set. Fran's in the hospital. She's in room 217. She has pneumonia. It's still not cleared up from the abdominal infection she had last week. So she was up all night, not responding very well this morning, so Chuck took her in and they admitted her. So I saw her at the middle of the afternoon. She seems to be doing a little bit better, but she'll be there probably at least 3 days. That's normally what happens when you're going for a case of pneumonia like that. Hopefully she'll respond. Was there when the doctor was there. They're going to change up her medicine. They said they do that if you return with pneumonia pretty quickly, and so it looks like she's getting good care. So keep her in your prayers. Add John Bauman, B-A-U-M-A-N, to your prayers. This is Bill Morrison's brother-in-law. He's an elder at South Knoxville. He has COVID. Has a pretty bad case of it, so he needs your prayers. Wayne went to Seymour the other night. The doors were closed. A lady drove up and said they've shut down the services because nine members there have COVID. So it's still there. Fortunately not here thus far. Yes, Jane? Okay. Well, I know they shut down for 2 weeks from what I've heard, so hopefully they'll get through that. But anyway, as far as we know, the people at Seymour are not in the hospital. And John's not in the hospital either, is he, Bill? I know he's still having a... Uh-huh. Okay. Well, so keep John Bowman in your prayers and the church at Seymour, and hopefully no one else here will get that. I keep Jennifer Lepowski in your prayers. This is the granddaughter of Carolyn White. She had been battling cancer for about 2 years. When they first diagnosed her, said that they couldn't do much, and she tried different alternative treatments and gave her more time, but now it's come back and supposedly in stage 4. That means it's started to spread, so I know they'd appreciate your prayers. I don't have any additions or updates on the list. Anybody have any additions? Sick folks? We need to keep Ann Chafin. In Sunday's bulletin, I put Ann Lee, the wife of Jerry Lee, the brother of Joyce Lee. The last name is Chafin. Ann Chafin, the wife of Jerry Chafin. This brother of Joyce Lee was recently diagnosed with a rare eye condition, and that's led her to have a lot of hallucinations, and that's really made things difficult at home. And they're doing some study online. When you have failing eyesight, sometimes the brain fills in the gap for what you don't see, and you see things that are not there and people not there. So it's really created a very unpleasant situation there at home. That situation can last up to 12 to 18 months. There's no real medicine for that, and so they're really going through a tough time, and Joyce would like to keep them in our prayers. Anybody else? Sunday night, we get back in the fellowship meal swing. We're going to have taco night part 2, because when we had taco night a couple of weeks ago, hardly anybody was here, and that meat was frozen, and now will be warmed up come Sunday night. So we'll have some other stuff to go with it. But sometimes people like to know what we're doing, but that'll give you some idea of at least what a major part of the meal will be. So, all right, Brother Lee.
Prepared for tonight. And one note on class for Sunday, I've got handouts I've got to go print out. So I think what I'll do, can y'all hear this all right? What I think I'll do is, when we start on Bible class tonight, I'll go and print out handouts for next Sunday, and I'll pass that out like I did last week. So that's what I'm doing with those papers once we get into our Bible class. For some thoughts to share tonight for our devotion, I'm going to read from Ephesians and Galatians in a minute. And think about where we ought to be coming from and where we ought to be going. I want to share a thought that I read in a book the other day. I was reading a book called The Devils by Fyodor Dostoevsky. It's a Russian writer from the 1800s. He's the same guy that wrote Crime and Punishment. This book, The Devils, was written in 1871. And what it's about, the bad guys in the book, the devils, are a bunch of agitators. This is a time period where communism was being written about, where nihilism, those are developing philosophies of that time. So we see a lot of results of communism, socialism, nihilism in our culture and in other recent history. But at the time that this book was written, that was a newer philosophy and really taking a hold. So in this book, the bad guys in this book are people that are agitating, and they're trying to stir people up, and they're trying to get nihilist cells of people to go out there and cause trouble. So I'm going to read some dialogue from this book because it really made me think about modern times. That's a good thing about a classic novel, is there's a lot of timeless stuff in there. So in this book, a lot of it could seem pretty modern because there's a lot of people that are promoting atheism, promoting nihilism, and they're trying to get away from a lot of the moral values. So in this passage I'm going to read, there's two characters that are ringleaders in this group of nihilist people that are trying to spread this movement. And they're having a dialogue about their beliefs and how they could basically go and recruit. So the dialogue here reads, "Do you know what they've said about us? That our creed is in essence a negation of honor, and that the easiest way in which a person could be won over is by telling him frankly that he has a right to be dishonorable." They're trying to recruit people and say we could convert people by telling them they have a right to be dishonorable. And then the next person says, "Exactly put, golden words, a bullseye. The right to be dishonorable. Why, this ought to make everybody come running to you." So I underlined that in the book. Our creed is in essence a negation of honor. The easiest way a person could be won over is by telling him he has a right to be dishonorable. And the right to be dishonorable would make everybody come running to us. So let's think about a lot of things that we see in our culture. There's a lot of academics and a lot of modern philosophers that preach this, nihilist philosophy or atheism. They say that there's no such thing as true value. It is what you want it to be. There's no such thing as true morals. What is moral is what you define it to be. And that gets away from what we read in the book, that morality is defined by God, and that is part of God's law. So even though this book was written 140 years ago, it's still very relevant. We have people that are essentially trying to convert people to atheism, nihilism, because you say, congratulations, you have the right to be dishonorable. Don't worry about any sense of shame. Don't worry about a sense of honor. You can do whatever you want without consequences. The Bible warns us about that. Now, I said I was going to read from Ephesians. Let's read Ephesians chapter 2. This is where we all started from. No matter at what point in our life we converted to Christianity, we all start somewhere in a sinful state. And we have to fight to stay out of that sinful state by constantly being in prayer and repentance. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 reads, "And you were dead in the trespasses and sin in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath like the rest of mankind." So this applies to all of us at certain points of our lives. We were all the sons of disobedience. We were all children of wrath at certain times. And we all followed the prince of the power of the air. And we all followed the spirit of the world, ungodliness and worldliness. And that's what that philosophy is all about. That embracing dishonor means that you're going to follow the powers of the world and you're going to ignore the commands of God. So at what point in time, we're all in that state of sin. Now, in Ephesians 4, we have a challenge. Paul writes to us in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 17, "Now I say this and testify in the Lord, that you must no longer walk as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their minds. They are darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God, because of the ignorance that is in them, due to their hardness of heart. They have become callous and have given themselves up to sensuality, greedy to practice every kind of impurity. But that is not the way that you learn Christ. So we have a challenge. Paul calls us to turn that life behind us. Abandon this calling to be dishonorable. Abandon the temptation to follow atheism, to follow a sinful worldly life. The false teachers of the world will get people to follow a sense of dishonor, just like in that book, and people will chase it. That's the path of least resistance. But Paul calls us to no longer walk down that path. Now let's note some word choices. In verse 19, again, it says, they have become callous and have given themselves up to sensuality, greed, to practice every kind of impurity. That phrase, given themselves up. And what does that mean, to give themselves up? Let's look across the page at Ephesians chapter 25 and look at similar wording here. We read this Sunday. Ephesians 5:25 says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Here we see that same phrase used in two opposite ways. In chapter 4, we have a warning to turn back from giving yourself up to the world. In chapter 5:25, we're told to be like Christ, who gave himself up for the church. The phrase to give himself up, to give yourself up, that's that sacrificial meaning. If you give yourself up, you're sacrificing yourself. So one way or the other, we make a choice on who we sacrifice ourselves to. We could sacrifice our spiritual self so we could gain the worldliness and all that temporary pleasure in the world, or we could sacrifice our worldly self and gain spiritual health and reunion with God. So let's think about that. One way or the other, we are going to give ourselves up to one power. We'll give ourselves up to the power of God, or we'll give ourselves up to the power of the world. So going back to this quote from this book, let's not follow that call to be dishonorable and follow any sort of moral relativism of the world. Let's not follow the call to be dishonorable and follow any worldly philosophies or worldly religions. Let's give ourselves up for Christ as Christ gave himself up for us. Now let's also turn to Galatians chapter 4. Let's make sure we don't backslide from that. Galatians chapter 4, verse 8 reads, formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not God's. But now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world, whose slaves you want to be once more? So we can't follow that doctrine of once saved, always saved. This is an active task to not backslide into the worldly philosophies and the worldly temptations. If we give ourselves up for Christ, there's always a temptation to turn around and give ourselves up to the world and to abandon that path. So let's make sure that we're being firm in what we do. Now, a few verses down in Galatians 5, verses 1, let's read that. For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. So here, similar thoughts. Christ has set us free. Let's stand firm. Let's not submit again to a yoke of slavery. Now let's look again at that word choice. Paul says, do not submit to a yoke of slavery. Do not submit to sin. Do not submit to the worldly philosophies. Do not submit to the temptation to be dishonorable. Now hopefully that phrase, do submit, sounds familiar too. We talked about that last week also. So let's turn back to Ephesians chapter 5 and look at that word choice. Again, a lot of this was fresh in my mind from class Sunday, talking about the word submit and to give ourselves up. Ephesians chapter 5, we read, we read about the word submit. 5:22, wives submit to your husbands. Now in verse 24, now as the church submits to Christ. So if we think back to what we studied about that word submit, that means to obey the authority of. So we make a choice on who we submit to. There's no in between. You either submit to Christ or you submit to the forces of the world. Paul warns us not to submit to the world. Paul commands us to submit to Christ. So one way or the other, we submit to some authority, either the authority of God or the authority of sin, the false authority of sin. One way or the other, we give ourselves up. We either give ourselves up to Christ in a sacrificial sense, or we give ourselves up to the sin, and we sacrifice our spiritual life for that worldly pleasure of sin. So I just want to share those thoughts. And again, going back to this book I read from, there's a lot of worldly philosophies, a lot of corrupt thoughts where people try to entice people saying, you're allowed to be dishonorable. You're allowed to put away shame. You're allowed to do whatever you want without consequences. Let's make sure we don't submit to that temptation. Let's submit to Christ. Let's make sure we're giving ourselves up to Christ so we don't submit to sin, so we don't give ourselves up to the worldly pleasures of the world. Now, this is just hopefully a few words of encouragement. We're all regular members here, but we all need support. We all need encouragement. And we're here as a church family to support each other so we could all remain strong, so we could all continue submitting to God, so we could all continue giving ourselves up to Christ. We're about to stand up and sing the invitation song. If there's any need, let's let that be known while we stand and sing together.
He will create anew, make whole again. Your empty, wasted years, He will restore, and your iniquities remember no more. Bring Him your every care, if great or small, whatever troubles you, oh, bring it all. Bring Him the haunting fears, the nameless dread. Thy heart He will relieve, and lift up thy head. Blessed Savior of us all, Almighty friend, His presence shall be ours unto the end. Without Him life would be how dark, how drear, but with Him morning breaks, and heaven is near.
Well, more have come in. We appreciate the presence of all. Appreciate what you prepared. The remarks tonight, devotion, something to think about. And ask you will, if you will, the word of prayer. And then we'll be dismissed their classes.
Our most Heavenly Father, we thank you for many blessings to us, especially that we can worship in peace together. And we thank you for your Son, Jesus Christ, and His Word, your Word that teaches us about Him and how we can be saved. We thank you, Father, for all of our family members. Pray for those who are not with us who may be ill, and those who are here who are struggling with illnesses as well. Pray that for you to put your healing hand upon them. Bless our study of your word tonight and keep us safe. Father, be with members of our armed forces and our police forces around the world and around the country. Father, keep them safe as well. We ask that you forgive us, Father, as we forgive one another. In Jesus' name, amen.
You have your handout from last week. You can get it out. If you don't have it, I have more made. So raise your hand if you need the handout. We've got 4 lessons stapled together. The love test, part 1, 2. Tonight we're going to be looking at number 3. So if you need a handout, just raise your hand. We'll see that you get that. You'll take care of it for me. You're a good guy. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and read the chapter again to start out, and then ask a few questions to start the discussion. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the love chapter. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I have become sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith, so that I could remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing. Love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not parade itself, is not puffed up, does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not provoked, thinks no evil, does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. Whether there are prophecies, they will fail. Whether there are tongues, they will cease. Whether there is knowledge, it will vanish away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part will be done away. When I was a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know just as I also am known. And now abideth faith, hope, love, these 3, but the greatest of these is love. And then dropping down to chapter 14, the first verse, the first 2 words, pursue love. So he was laying out there what they should be doing, what the standard should be. How did the church get in that such a bad shape to begin with? Let's think first of all about the mindset. I know Luke is talking about a book that was written in the 1870s when communism was beginning to be thought about, nihilism. That's the mindset that says life has no meaning at all. It was already beginning to win adherence to that. What was going on at Corinth that caused them, chapters 12, 13, and 14 deal with spiritual gifts. Why did they need this teaching? What happened? These were Christians, but they weren't acting like Christians. What was the problem? Okay. That's a good summary of what this section is about. Well, if you go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 3, and Charles mentioned, by the way, what was it like in Corinth of that day? What was Corinth like? That was like the Las Vegas of today. That was one wicked city. And so when they came into the church, did they give up all those things? Like somebody as well said, baptism doesn't drown the devil. You come into the church with various good desires and certain bad desires, and you have to be taught out of that. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, the Apostle Paul, he gave the attitude that was to be condemned. Look at beginning at verse 1, 1 Corinthians chapter 3. And I, brethren, cannot speak to you as to spiritual people, but as to carnal. as the babes in Christ. I fed you with milk and not with solid food, for until now you are not able to receive it. And even now you're still not able. Why? For you're still carnal. So what was the problem? Well, what does it mean to be carnal? Well, you're still thinking like the world. You're thinking like the philosophy of the world. And that's what caused people, as Charles mentioned, to be envious when they had various spiritual gifts. Which spiritual gifts were to be most desired? What's that? Speaking in tongues, the showy type, the type that everybody could see. And they would be getting up. I mean, imagine back then, that the spiritual gifts were regulated, by the way, in chapter 14. If you could look ahead, most of you probably know, how many people, if they had the gift of tongues, how many could speak at one time? Only one. And in a worship service, never more than 2 or 3, and only speak in tongues if you had an interpreter to explain what all that was. That's not what they were doing. No, they were envious, they were jealous. I mean, can you imagine what worship is like? It's like a madhouse. Everybody get up and saying this and saying that, and he mentioned, you can stop this. You can regulate this. It's not like some people claim today. I didn't have any choice. I asked for it and I got it, and here's what came out. That's not the way it worked. You could control that. Why spiritual gifts to begin with? Just to make sure we understand the context. And he mentioned there these things would fail. Why did they have? Sometimes it misses some people. Why were they still in spiritual gifts? They didn't have a Bible. They hadn't been written yet, hadn't been put together. And so how would the Christians and churches that were established know what to do? So that's when, and who had the power to impart spiritual gifts? Only the apostles could. Acts chapter 8 have a good example. Philip went up to Samaria, and then a couple of the apostles went up there. They laid hands on them, and they saw that's the way the gifts were conferred. And so that's the only way they had it back then. The apostles had to pass it on. Could somebody, once they had that, pass it on to somebody else? No. And when the apostles died, when all those people who had that power died, what happened to the spiritual gifts? It all ended. But by that time, then that which is perfect had come there. And so, everything out there is, your philosophy will dictate, your worldview, the kind of morals that you have. Down through the years, especially 20th century, I've read people who thought that without God, they could go to a community, create a utopia, where God's never mentioned, just people that are all atheists, they have that in common, and they go together in a community and not have any God in it, and everything would be perfect. Do you think that's the way it worked? Why would that not work? Because people are still carnal, people are still selfish, people still are going to get what they want to get, and after a while, what the needs of someone else might have, it doesn't matter. So what was the motivation? We were looking at a passage. Why would anybody that's a Christian want to learn how to suffer long? Instead of getting even with somebody who's done something evil to you, to pay them back not with evil, but with kindness. That's the second one. What would be the motivation to do that anyway? Why change? Okay, that's the key. And in the closing verses of Matthew chapter 5, in the Sermon on the Mount, what was the hard saying regarding enemies? Well, he mentioned that, but what was the attitude towards, let's look at it. What were they supposed to do to people who were enemies, consider themselves enemies? Matthew 5. You've heard it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemies. Bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. It's one of the most important verses for people to remember. Why were they to do that? This is a hard saying. Why should they not get even with people who would choose to be an enemy against them? What's that verse? Put it in your own words. Look at verse 48 and tell me what the motivation is. And this would be true of all the 15 different defining characteristics that we have. We can go through them, discuss them, understand what's it talking about and the way we should live towards one another. But there it is. Here's the teaching. Here's what God wants. But you still have to be motivated to do what God wants. Some of these things are hard to do, like the first one, to be patient with people. So for that verse, why should Christians take on those things and not treat enemies like they were an enemy? What's the motivation there from that passage? Be Christ-like, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. What does that mean? I mean, if God's your Father, and, Christianity is what it is, then we're supposed to be Christ-like. And drop down to verse 48, what was the ultimate standard? Don't do what everybody else is doing. What should your standard? What should be kept before you all the time? The standard, trying to be like the Father. And when Jesus was here on this earth, in every one of these, we could look at how Jesus manifests these qualities, especially when it comes to envy or jealousy. When he was here on this earth, whose glory was he after? It's mentioned, we got a passage there in the book of John. I've glorified you on earth. I've done what you asked me to do. Why would he want to do that? Well, because they loved each other. He was God in the flesh. That's what God does. That's the way God thinks. And so as a Christian, if you're following someone who's a leader, if our leader is Christ, we wear his name, then you would want to, in everything, follow him. And even that's including the Great Commission. And in Matthew's passage, what does it say? Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them, teaching them what? What are the all things about? Learning to live and act and think and move like Christ. And so that's the thing that people have gotten. They were still carnal. They're still worldly minded when it comes to division. Why would they want to cause strife? Well, why did they want to tear up the church? When the Lord's Supper, how had they abused the Lord's Supper? Boy, they really messed that up. What were they doing? Made a common meal. Some of them were coming in even drunk. And so the rich folks are getting together, having their meal. I mean, what would be the motivation to do that? Well, they're still acting like the world. They hadn't changed the one that they're trying to please. They hadn't changed their life system, hadn't changed their philosophy. And that's where they were wrong. And so if you're going to act like a Christian and say you want to be a Christian, this is what you simply do. So, and every one of these, it goes back to the motivation. Why should we, if we're not kind, why should we be kind? That's what God's asking us to do. Questions or comments before we look at number 3? Love does not envy. If you made a list of the top sins, of course, stealing and adultery and would be on it. You think envy, jealousy would be on the people's top 10? Maybe some, but probably not everybody. That's not one of the biggies. But how devastating can envy and jealousy be? Well, I've got in the notes there, it's different levels, like in every one of these. There's the superficial envy that says, I want what you have. Example, somebody gets a new car, I wish I had that. And I've heard even Christians say that, how do you get that? He can't afford that. And what they're saying is, he's got something I don't have, and I don't like that he's got something I don't have. And so it can be various levels. When it's deep-rooted, it's not only that, you want it, you don't want him to have it to begin with. And so we give some examples of that. From Eve, I've got her listed. What would be her motivation? To partake of the forbidden fruit. That has to do with jealousy. Why would she partake of the fruit? What would be the advantage? What was so enticing about it? That you would be like God. Well, God was telling him what to do. Sometimes that's the big reason why a lot of people, scientists, don't want to acknowledge God, because if there's a God there, you're going to one day have to stand before him, and people don't want to have to do that. And so Eve saw an option. How about the brothers of Joseph? It's mentioned in Acts chapter 7, verse 9. They were jealous of him. And the father, he made it hard on others, but instead of thinking ill will towards their brother, what would have been a mature thought of some of the others? Of what, if you know the makeup of Jacob and his sons and his wives, Joseph, he had the coat of many colors. Others didn't like that. Those of you who grew up with brothers and sisters, is it sometimes easy to be envious and jealous? What's that? He showed that. And sometimes, that's a hard thing when you're at home and you got a parent who favors one over the other. So you can see why most people, unless they have the mature mindset, but still yet, what should have kept them from being mean towards Joseph? What should have kept them? Well, let's jump ahead to the prodigal son. In Luke chapter 15, the prodigal son came home. What was the attitude of the brother? What did he say? Let's look at it real quick. Luke chapter 15. We see this attitude. This is one of the best descriptions of that attitude. Luke 15. Yeah, and what was the father's response? That's the key. What was the father's response? That's what you have to remember. Luke 15. What's that? That's right. That's what it said. Look, I've been the faithful son. I didn't do all this stuff. Verse 25, now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing, so he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, your brother has come, and because he's received him safe and sound, your father has killed the fatted calf. But he was angry. He would not go in, therefore his father came out and pleaded with him. So he answered and said to the father, lo, these many years I've been serving you. I never transgressed your commandment at any time, and yet you never gave me a young goat that I might make merry with my friends. But as soon as this son of yours, didn't even call him a brother, as soon as this son of yours came, who's devoured your livelihood with harlots, you killed the fatted calf for him. Look at the father's answer. Verse 31 and 32. And he said to him, son, you're always with me, and all that I have is yours. It was right that we should make merry and be glad, for your brother was dead and is alive and was lost and is found. So what was his answer? It was the right thing to do. Why is it the right thing to do? Because look where he was. And look what he came back to. So, I mean, if you're a father, you've got the right to do whatever you want to do. And when you look around and make the application in the world, see, that's when it's sometimes hard. If you're a Christian going through tough times, maybe financially or health-wise, and you see someone else who's not near as faithful as you, they don't even go to church. And they've got a better job or better health, and things are going so well for them. Everything seems like they're people, everything they touch seems to turn to gold. Why is God so good to them for that? And you're trying so hard, and the things that you need, they've got in abundance. You can see why people sometimes feel that. What's the mature attitude, though? What's the mature attitude for the Christian? How does he look at that? Why should you be happy? If you really have the right kind of love, you want them to get what they want. And that's the thing that, going back to Matthew chapter 5, when he said, the sun and rain falls on the just and on the unjust, what did he imply by that? And to those people today who are wicked, never darken the door of a church building, why does God bless them that way to begin with? He still loves them. And what area of blessings can he give for them? Now, the spiritual blessings are reserved for who? Christians. And so really the only area in which he can do anything for them is what area? There are Christian parents today, maybe some here, who have children faithful in the church and children who are not faithful in the church. Maybe they left the church years ago. How do those Christian parents treat the child that left the church? When they come home, come over vacation, spend a week, bring the kids over, grandkids and all that. How will the Christian parent treat that child? It's still your child. I mean, the natural affection that should be inborn in you that Paul refers to in Romans chapter 1, that should be something that you should do. But if you have Christian children, though, when you get to go Sundays and spend the Lord's Day with them, maybe you're privileged to have them go to church with you. Or maybe they're members of another place, they come home. What are your conversations about with that child? How close are you with that child who's faithful in the church? What kind of conversation do you have with that child? I mean, you're closer because you have the same life. You have the same value system, the same philosophy, the same worldview. You're a Christian. You can understand things. The way you think, the way you live, the motivation for doing all those things is the same. Even though it's your son, he's still a brother in Christ. And so God looks at those people. The only way he can bless them with things is through that realm. And they're going to get that. But there's a certain point in time, well, what does God do with blessings? Romans chapter 1, we mentioned that. Paul goes ahead and says, let me show you what happened in the Gentile world, how it destructed, how it internally. But 3 times it said, God gave them over to. What does that mean? A reprobate mind or whatever. As their sin progressed, what happened to those people? People that became evil and more evil and more evil and more evil. What happens after a while with them? Even though God still loves them, how does God act? Does God still keep getting them everything good to the very end? What happens? When it says God gave them over to, what does that mean? What would they lose? Yeah. Here's a family. Here's the guy who's got 3 sons. And he says, let me tell you what it's going to be. If you ever get in trouble, go to jail, you can call me. One time. If you go to jail again, because I know this is what my dad always said, you don't get yourself in trouble, I'll be there. But if you are crazy enough to go back to jail a second time, you are on your own. He's still the dad, but why would he say that? Why would he pull back? To teach a lesson. I mentioned that one of the best friends, a member of the church that we baptized up in Cincinnati, he was the administrator of Hamilton County, that's where Cincinnati, juvenile court. He taught graduate level psychology courses at Xavier University. He was a national lecturer in things like communication and family values and things like that. But he told about time and time again, here would be a guy, got a kid, 16-year-old kid in trouble. He's broken the law, done something, and the guy wants to meet with Nick, and he comes up and tells Nick, what do we need to do to make this go away? What do you think Nick's attitude was? I mean, he's saying basically, I know he did it, but let's just wipe it clean. And Nick would say, but your son broke the law. Oh, I know, and you know how kids are. You're a kid once, but your son broke the law. But we got to be able to do something. I mean, he's a good kid. Your son broke the law. And every time he'd say that, he'd get louder and louder till he'd be screaming, your son broke the law. Why would he do that? Because if he didn't own up and do, what should a father be doing with that? There should be, I know the first time mercy and all that kind of stuff, but what should be the action of a proper parent when a child is blown it? You got mercy and grace and try to help find out why he did it and so forth. But the child continually does that, what would a parent do? After a while, he pulls away his protective cover, and my dad said, son, you're on your own. And so what do you mean by that? Here's the question. Does God do that with people out there in the world? Can you get to the point where you can't be brought back? And then he uses you as a good example of a bad example? And life gets hard for people who are selfish? That's the way it works. And then there's a point in time when people why was Abraham told, You get this promised land, but not now. You have to wait 4 generations, 430 years. What was the reason that God told Abraham, you don't get it now? What was the reason? Well, there's another reason he mentioned there. Well, anybody know? What was the reason why they had to wait? Because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? What's that? But it wasn't to the point yet where he would do what? In 1 Samuel 15, what was the command given by God through Samuel to Saul regarding the Amalekites? Go and utterly destroy the Amalekites. How much? Their animals, man, woman, wipe them off the face of the earth. How bad do you think they got? They had to be pretty bad. And the Canaanites finally, why would God have people, all these different tribes, because what was Joshua's job? You go in there and wipe them completely off the land. It was theirs. They had it for a while. It's not theirs anymore. I'm giving it to you. Why would he take it from these people and give it to Joshua and the Israelites? Because he's God, and he can do what? He gives the people what he wants. In his plan, with what he promised Abraham through Israel, through the seed would come and all that, he would have a nation that would be special. You know, a nation of priests and all that, Exodus chapter 19. But God goes so far with people, when he gets so far, what does he do? He shuts the door of grace, and then what? You don't get anything going your way, and life can get pretty hard. So I'm just saying, seeing how God works and what God does. So does God have the right then to give you certain talents? I mean, some of you have a higher intellect than others. Some of you are given skills by birth that make you more marketable and have a better likelihood of a better job that makes a lot of money compared to some other people and so forth. God has physical limitations on some. Anybody know somebody that was born with the look at their mom and dad? Why is family history important? Here's a good question. Why can't you marry your sister? What would happen genetically? Those of you that know what's that? It wouldn't be the thing to do, but if you keep doing that, the problems this one has, the problem this had, by the time they work all that out, how bad would the problems be? That's right. The recession, the bad stuff, it gets passed on from generation. I mean, not everybody has all bad stuff, but is there a healthier stock of people than others? Like my family. My family generally stays pretty healthy, but not normally heart issues. That's the reason why I was surprised when the doctor said, I think you have a heart attack, because we don't have that. We don't have heart issues, big ones. But cancer takes care of us. My mom's mother died at 49 of cancer. My mother, even though she had a stroke, she had cancer. My father died he had Alzheimer's, but he weighed 115 pounds because the cancer ate him up. I mean, almost everybody in our family, nobody makes it past 80. I'm sorry. But how old's your mama? 93. How old was your dad when he died? 85. She'll probably outlive me. She doesn't like me talking stuff like that. But, family history means something. Why did she get that stuff, that gene, the long liver gene, and I not get it? Well, you marry people and so forth, but nobody ever gets it all, do they? God gives you what he wants you to have. Is that true? Except, now here's Bill Morrison. How long ago was it you were diagnosed with lymphoma cancer? 2004. How long ago was that? 8 years ago. It's stage 4. How many years did you fight the cancer? 3 years. What was it like? It was rough. 3 years. And so why'd he go through that? He's one of the finest people I know. Why'd he get that? Why did God choose that? See, these are questions I need to be able to ask and answer. God is going to do what? But for the Christian, Philippians 4, verse 19, what is that? What did Paul say is going to happen? Look at Philippians 4, verse 19. What's the thing Christians need to be reminded of? See, God will supply every need according to his riches. Now, before that passage was shared, Paul said, here's what, and he used an example. I've learned in whatever state I am to be what? To be content. Should Christians do that? How can you do that? How can you learn in whatever material, financial state you find yourself in to not pitch a fit when it's not what you want? How can a Christian accept that? How can you have a value system, a philosophy, if you will, that says, I'm okay with what I got. I'll make do with what I got. If I got all kinds of money, I'll make do with that. That'd be hard. I know the temptations. But whatever the Lord gives me today, I'll be just fine. What does it take to get to that? First of all, you have to have faith in what? God knows what he's doing, because ultimately, what's he trying to do? It's not about your health or longevity, how long you live, and your intellect, and how much money you make. What is it about? Why are you here on this earth to begin with? Now, he will take the things that happen, and Romans 8:28, and we know that all things work together for good, ultimately, but it's conditional to those that love the Lord. Number one, what's the second one? To those who are called according to his purpose. What does that mean? What does that mean? Well, what's the next verse? We know what Romans 8:28. What's Romans 8:29 say? That gives you an idea of what his purpose is for you. What's that? We'll close with that. What's verse 29 after the great promising verse of Romans 8:28? Somebody read verse 29 for me. Okay, so what the purpose is, every Christian, every day a Christian gets up, his mindset should be, I want to be like my Lord. And his kingdom that he founded, he's King Jesus. How high should it be on our list? Matthew 6:33. Seek first his kingdom. Is it worth it? On the day of Pentecost, Peter said, this Jesus whom you crucified, God made him Lord and Christ. Not just the forgiver of sins, but when he said, I made him Lord, what does that mean? See, that people want the forgiveness part, but the Lord part, the master part, that's the part they don't want. But if you are live for that and live for him, then what will your life be like? Book of Luke, real quick. There's a passage that just comes to mind. Here's going to be a hard saying. Luke 17, real quick. Verse 6. So the Lord said, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you can say to this mulberry tree, be pulled up by the roots and be planted in the sea, and it would obey you. Which of you, having a servant plowing or tending sheep, will say to him when he's come in from the field, come at once and sit down to eat? But will he not rather say to him, prepare something for my supper, and gird yourself and serve me till I've eaten and drunk, and afterward you will eat and drink? Does he thank that servant because he did those things that were commanded? So if you got a master, what's he saying here? It's time to eat. You think the master gets supper ready for the servants? Who fixes supper? The servants come in and do that. Does the master, when they get home at night, everybody goes to the bunkhouse, does the master have a sweet little thank you card and some mints on everybody's pillow? Is that what they get? The hard saying is, so likewise you, when you've done all the things which you commanded, say, we're profitable servants, we've done that which is our duty to do. See, that's hard. But see, if you have sufficient faith, wherever he sends you, you will. When somebody says, I'm crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me, what decisions do you make? What values judgments do you make? It's all about him. And it starts with learning to love like him. If you don't do that, life will not fall in place. He can't use you. So our time is up. We're going over 2 minutes. Apologize for that. Next week we'll look at the fourth one. Don't parade itself. Don't be conceited. Don't brag. What would be the motivation to do that? What are things you could do to keep that happening? Men are good at that. That's one thing I learned about the Navy. You know, when a guy says, let me tell you what I did. You know what men are good at? I can top that. Guy says, I caught a fish this big. What's the next guy say? I caught one this big. I mean, people are always topping each other in their story and so forth, so that can get out of hand, but not for the Christian. If he has 5 talents, if he's blessed to have this, if he could speak in tongues, whatever, don't be conceited with it. Maybe an attitude would be like Job. What did he say? The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Our time is up. We appreciate you all. Everybody get the handout you wanted, look.